Here is a new medium to me called graphite powder, and this graphite powder happens to be water soluble. I worked with this in a drawing workshop, like an all-day drawing workshop, earlier in May, and I really enjoyed it. And in the workshop, we really were only using it on primed paper, primed with, I think, 2 coats of gesso. But here I am playing with it in my sketchbook. This is, I think, an Etchr sketchbook. It's quite nice, smooth paper. You could see there I was trying to scratch back in with my brush, and it didn't really do a whole lot because it absorbs into the paper. Here I am using one of my wooden pens and trying it different ways. It made some really nice marks. Twisting it after covering the tip with the powdered graphite. You can see in the footage that it has sort of almost a gel consistency. And here I am, so I just dipped the brush in water. Now it's looking much more like, almost like a granulating watercolor. So this is an interesting medium because, similar to watercolor or gouache or any kind of paint, the more you dilute it, it has different qualities. And here I am using that wooden pen to just test things out and dragging it from that puddle. And it does have a really, really cool granulating effect when you use it watered down like that. And the darker areas, you can see, look much more like when you go over and over and over an area with graphite with a pencil. They're a little bit metallic and shiny looking. They're doing some more testing with that wooden pen, and with the pen wet, it did actually manage to scrape some of it off the surface, unlike earlier when I was trying with the end of my brush. You'll notice in this video that I switch hands rather a lot. It's just kind of fun to try different shapes, and because it's kind of a gel consistency as opposed to a pure liquid like ink, it shows your brush strokes quite a bit. It doesn't immediately just soak into the paper, it just sits on top because it's graphite. It's not actually like a dye or colored water. It's granules of graphite floating in the water. Here I've gotten out my trusty liner. I don't know actually if that's a liner or a rigger brush, but it's a very long bristled brush. And I'm making some fiddly lines with that, using different weights, different amounts of water. You will also notice that, unlike with watercolor or ink, it gets paler as the more brush strokes you make, even though you've got quite a bit on your brush, because it's a gel form rather than pure actual liquid. Your brush starts to dry out a lot if you're not using a lot of water with it. So it's really fun because it's basically painting a pencil. It's a pencil in the form of a paintbrush. Here I am trying to get some varied brush strokes, trying out some dry brush techniques. Back to the liner, making some squigglies. As you can imagine, because it is powdered graphite, when it dries, when all the water has evaporated, it's very messy. Like, this is a medium that absolutely requires fixative. I use generally the I'm having trouble with words. I typically use fixative that is not an aerosol and that is not chemical. It's a casein based fixative. I've showed it in some of my other videos, and I'll put put it in the notes because I can't think of the name of it right now. But it's a non-toxic fixative. The only downside to it is that, in particular for something like this, that is a powder sitting on top of the paper, it needs many coats. Many coats. So in fact, after I had finished working on this and I worked on a couple of loose sheets of paper, I did end up using a more classic workable fixative from the aerosol because I was feeling impatient and I wanted to be able to close my book without ruining everything. Really enjoying making those squiggly lines with the wooden pen. The wooden pen is an interesting solution for this because it won't get clogged. I would never try this with a dip pen because I just think it would clog immediately and you would get absolutely nothing out of it. And it would probably also ruin your nib. But it's really wonderful with those carved bamboo. I keep calling it wooden, but it's bamboo. It's a bamboo pen. Bamboo calligraphy pen. So here you can see some of my tests and squiggles, and you can see the varying levels of intensity that are possible. And now we're switching to something that is the same brand. It's called Cretacolor or Cretacolor. This is the charcoal powder, which is also water soluble. And this time I had the foresight to show you basically how I mix up the gel. I used a teaspoon, I put some in there, and then I added water to it. I wore a mask because this is not stuff that you would want to breathe in. This one you can see is also extremely granulating. Even more so, I think, than the graphite powder. And I'm using the exact same tools. I was using like about a 1-inch wide flat brush, and I'm using this bamboo pen, playing with some wet in wet there. Really enjoyed the specks that appeared when I just grabbed a bunch of it on the brush. I'm not sure what exactly caused that, but it's interesting. Oh, and I just obliterated some of them. So I think in some of these cases I am dipping the brush first into plain water and then into the gel mixture. Here I am putting some water down to test out a more watercolory technique of actually doing wet and wet for real, to see if it has the same kind of bleeds that watercolor does, and ink. I'm going from a dry area into a wet area, so you can see it really does make a difference despite being granules floating in water versus really mixed in liquid paint. Though I suppose when you get right down to it, watercolor is also granules suspended in liquid, but I think they tend to be much finer unless you get the granulating watercolors. Here I am playing with spraying it to see if it does any of the same kinds of things that ink does. Not really. It doesn't create those spatters that spraying ink does. Here's some fun pulling the powdered charcoal into the wet area, which made kind of fun little star shapes. And there is the brush just doing some various shapes on the dry section of paper again. Spraying it, see what it does with dripping. It can do some of the things that ink does, and it doesn't replicate other things. But that's the point of testing it out. See what it can do. Put it through its paces. It's definitely less fine than working with black ink, so you can get a lot more textures and watching the way it separates as the water dries is interesting to see where you end up with the most pigment. Seeing what kind of detail I can get with it, pulling it out of the wet area, drawing some grass. This time I'm doing the same, but with the slender brush. And for my next trick, I'm going to try this powdered charcoal on a primed piece of the same paper. This is just super cheap. It's labeled watercolor paper, but it's so poor quality that I would hesitate to call it watercolor paper. But I'm just putting a quick single coat of gesso on here. And I'm going to do some more experimenting on this to see what it can do when it's really sitting on the surface. I got out my comb or rake. I can never remember which that brush is called, but making some grassy grass, some dry brush techniques. And going back to the liner, here you can see how when it's really dense black, it just dries up. Like, it's hard to get even a single line out of this using a soft watercolor brush. So maybe not the best for that. This is something that ink is much better at. And it's harder to get really fine lines as well. Here I've gone back to my 1-inch wide brush, and on the primed surface you can see much more the direction and where you've twisted, and it gives a whole story of how you made the shape with the brush. And as you can see here, while it's wet, probably while it's dry too, you can really etch into it. You can do some sgraffito on the primed paper because it's not soaking in at all. It's not staining the paper. Here I'm just using a Q-tip, a cotton swab to lift some of it, lighten some areas. A better tool for that than a cotton swab is actually using like a wet wipe, a baby wipe, which I think I do a bit later in this. Here I'm going over the top of it with a smaller brush to sort of add in some shadows and accentuate these shapes. When you twist the brush, end up looking quite a bit like ribbons or fabric. So I'm just kind of following that. Adding to the story. It's quite nice. It's quite fun. Doing some more ribbons, twisting that brush. These powdered materials I learned about through an artist who goes under the name of Mrs Bertimus. It was her workshop that I took where we used the powdered graphite on gessoed paper. And this, in fact, very technique right here of using the wet wipe with a stick was something that one of the other students in the class kind of stumbled upon, and we were all like, oh my god. I think that worked better, honestly, when we did it with the graphite. The graphite is a little bit finer than the powdered charcoal, so it gets more subtle effects, I think. I'd be curious to try them together. I think it could be quite fun, actually, to paint a whole panel with these, do sort of broad strokes of an image or design, and then just go in and draw over it with a stick, sort of like a scratchboard, but it would have much more nuance than scratchboard because it wouldn't just be a flat black with white lines. Even the lines where you scratch away have different amounts of gray left behind. This is what the graphite pages look like after they had dried. Here's me demonstrating. Yes, this picks up quite a lot. If you handle it without it being fixed, you will get fingerprints all over it. It will make a mess, so be warned. And then here's some previous pages that I had done. There's one where I literally turned one of the squiggles into a scarf. And the very earliest, those first two panels, are ones that I did in the workshop itself back in May on the Welbeck estate. Very fun. And I think here is the charcoal without gesso on the paper. You can see that it dried even more granular than it looked when the water was still wet. And finally, I will show you, this is the one that's on the gessoed paper. It actually doesn't granulate as much. It kind of holds it together more. So that's an interesting note. That's a good thing to know. That is all. Thanks, bye.